If someone had told me 10 years ago, or even 10 months ago, that my life would be bisected by a man who taught romantic poetry, I would have laughed. My life was a library, quiet and catalogued, each day a familiar page turned. I didn't do plot twists. I didn't do storms. And I certainly didn't do men like Professor Julian Croft. He was a disruption from the first day, a new hire in the English department, poached from some prestigious East Coast institution that was whispered about in the hallowed, dusty halls of our state university. He walked into our seminar on Keats and Shelley as if he owned the very air we were breathing. Tall, built in a way that seemed unfair for an academic, with a jaw that looked carved from granite and eyes the color of a winter storm. He didn't lecture from behind the podium. He paced the front of the room like a caged panther, his presence a low, thrumming hum of energy that made the very molecules in the room feel agitated. I, of course, was terrified of him. My existence was a carefully curated collection of low-stakes interactions. I sat in the back corner of every classroom. I spoke only when called upon. My papers were well researched, meticulously cited, and utterly devoid of any personal flair that might draw attention. I was a ghost haunting the stacks, a name on a roster, and that was exactly how I liked it. Professor Croft ruined all of that. He saw me, not just in the way a professor sees a student, a face to attach to a grade. He looked at me, really looked, and his gaze felt like a physical weight. It was analytical, dissecting. It made the blood rush to my face, and the words I had so carefully prepared die on my tongue. He would call on me, his voice a low baritone that cut through the classroom murmur, and wait. The silence he allowed to stretch after his question was a form of exquisite torture. It demanded something real, something more than a regurgitated textbook answer. And I hated him for it. I hated the way my heart became a frantic, trapped bird in my ribs when he entered the room. I hated the way I started dressing a little better for his class, picking out a sweater that wasn't covered in lint, combing my hair with a little more care. It was a betrayal of my own carefully constructed solitude. The distance between us was a chasm. He was the authority, the intellect, the man who held my academic future in his large, capable hands. I was just Leo, a 21-year-old student with an anxiety disorder and an unhealthy attachment to 19th century poets who all died tragically young. We were on different planets, orbiting different suns. Then came the storm. Not the metaphorical one brewing in my chest whenever he was near, but a real one, the kind with a name and a projected path and news anchors standing in the wind wearing unnecessary goggles. The university, in a rare act of foresight, announced it would be closing at 3 o'clock. Our seminar ended at 2:50. I was already packing my bag, my movements small and efficient, planning my escape. Just get to the door, get to my car, get back to my quiet, empty apartment where the only expectations were the ones I set for myself. Mr. Vance, a moment, please. The words sliced through my frantic internal monologue. I froze. The other students filed past me, a river of chatter and relief, flowing out into the hallway. I was a rock caught in the current, immobile. I turned slowly. Professor Croft was standing by his desk, holding my midterm essay. His expression was unreadable, which was its usual state. He looked at me, and that winter storm gaze pinned me to the spot. My paper? I managed, my voice a squeak. Your paper, he confirmed, his tone flat. He gestured to the chair beside his desk. Sit. It wasn't a request. I sat. My backpack felt heavy on my shoulders, a tangible representation of my desire to flee. Outside, the sky had turned a bruised, sickly yellow. The wind was beginning to howl, rattling the old window frames of the classroom. This was the disruption, the external event beyond my control. The universe, it seemed, had a sick sense of humor. It was about to force me into sustained interaction with the one person who could unravel me with a single look. He pulled up another chair so he was sitting opposite me, our knees almost touching. The proximity was suffocating. I could smell the faint, clean scent of his soap, a hint of coffee on his breath. My world, usually a wide, empty landscape, had shrunk to the few feet of space between us. He laid my paper on the desk. It was covered in red ink. My stomach plummeted. I was a good student. I never got papers back that looked like they had bled to death. "This is an interesting analysis, Leo," he began, and the use of my first name was a small, sharp shock. He had never used it before. It was always Mr. Vance. Formal, distant. "Is it bad?" I asked, the words tumbling out before I could stop them. A flicker of something, amusement, surprise, crossed his face. "No, it's not bad. It's brilliant." I stared at him. Brilliant was not a word in my vocabulary, not when it was applied to me. "But," he continued, and my brief moment of relief evaporated, "it's also completely impersonal. It's as if a machine wrote it. A very well-read, articulate machine, but a machine nonetheless. There's no soul in it." "Where are you in these pages?" I had no answer. I was nowhere in those pages. That was the entire point. I built walls of academic jargon and complex sentence structures to hide behind. It was my armor. He sighed, a sound of deep, weary frustration. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, and for the first time, the imposing facade of Professor Croft seemed to crack. I saw the faint lines of exhaustion around his eyes, a small silvery scar that bisected his left eyebrow, a detail I'd never noticed from the back of the room. He looked tired. He looked human. "You write about Keats's concept of negative capability as if you're describing a theorem in physics," he said, his voice softer now. "But it's not a theorem. It's a struggle. It's the act of being in uncertainties, mysteries, doubts, without any irritable reaching after fact and reason. You understand the definition, but I don't think you understand the feeling." The first fat drop of rain hit the window pane with a loud splat, then another and another. Within seconds, the sky opened up. The rain wasn't falling. It was being thrown, hurled against the glass by a wind that shrieked like something wounded. The lights flickered once, twice, and then died, plunging the room into a deep gray gloom. We were trapped. Just the two of us in the dying light, with the storm raging outside and an even more terrifying one building between us. The darkness was a strange comfort, a blanket. In the dim, storm-lit room, I felt slightly less exposed. He couldn't see the blush creeping up my neck, couldn't see the nervous way my fingers were twisting the strap of my backpack. He didn't say anything for a long moment. The only sounds were the roar of the wind and the percussive drumming of the rain. I could feel his presence more acutely in the dark, a solid shape of warmth and energy, just a few feet away. "Well," he finally said, his voice a low rumble, "it seems we're not going anywhere for a while." He stood up and moved towards the window, a tall silhouette against the bruised purple of the sky. I watched the line of his shoulders, the way he braced a hand against the wall as he looked out at the maelstrom. "I think my office will be more comfortable than this classroom," he said, his back still to me. "The building's emergency generator should kick in for the hallways, but the classrooms are out." His office, a place I had never been, a private space. My heart did a nervous little stutter step. "Okay," I whispered, my voice barely audible over the storm. He led the way. The hallway was, indeed, lit by the eerie, humming glow of emergency lights. Our shadows stretched long and distorted behind us. His office was at the end of the corridor, a simple wooden door with a small brass plate that read, J. Croft. He unlocked it and pushed it open, stepping aside to let me enter first. The room was small, but it felt like him. One wall was a floor-to-ceiling bookshelf, crammed with books stacked too deep. His desk was a large, imposing piece of dark wood, covered in neat piles of papers and more books. There was a worn leather armchair in the corner. The air smelled of old paper, coffee, and that same clean, masculine scent that was uniquely his. It was a sanctuary, a scholar's cave, and I was in it. The room was cold. The building's heating had evidently died with the power. I shivered, hugging my arms to my chest. He noticed immediately. He moved to a coat rack by the door and took down a thick, dark gray wool jacket. Here, he said, holding it out to me. You're freezing. I reached for it, my fingers clumsy. As I took the jacket, my hand brushed against his. It was nothing. A fleeting, accidental contact, skin on skin for less than a second, but it was everything. A jolt, sharp and electric, shot up my arm. Heat bloomed in my chest, a startling, vivid flower of warmth that spread through my entire body. I snatched my hand back, as if I'd been burned. My breath caught in my throat. Panic, shock, heat. I fumbled with the jacket, pulling it on. It was huge on me. The sleeves hung past my hands, and the shoulders drooped. It smelled of him, of wool and cold air, and something else, something warm and personal. I buried my face in the collar, inhaling his scent, and my mind went completely, blissfully blank for a moment. When I looked up, he was watching me. His expression was intense, his eyes dark in the gloom. I couldn't tell what he was thinking. The power dynamic, the carefully maintained distance of professor and student, felt thin and fragile, like a sheet of ice cracking under pressure. He cleared his throat and turned away, breaking the spell. He moved to his desk and switched on a small, battery-powered lamp. It cast a warm, golden circle of light, creating an island of intimacy in the dark room. I was supposed to be prepping for tomorrow's lecture on Shelley, he said, his voice sounding a little strained. He ran a hand through his dark hair. It was the first gesture I'd ever seen from him that seemed genuinely uncertain. All my notes are on my laptop, which, of course, has a dead battery. He looked at a pile of books on his desk with a kind of weary frustration. For the first time, he seemed at a loss. The all-knowing, confident Professor Croft was gone, replaced by a man trapped in his office, thwarted by a power outage. He was vulnerable. And in that moment, something shifted inside me. The fear receded, replaced by a strange, unfamiliar flicker of confidence. This was my territory. The words of these poets were not just academic subjects for me. They were my friends, my companions. I lived inside their verses. Which poem? I asked. My voice was quiet but steady. He looked up, surprised. Ozymandias, he said, and a few of the shorter lyrics. Without thinking, I began to recite. I met a traveler from an antique land who said, "Two vast and trunkless legs of stone stand in the desert." I didn't stop. The words flowed out of me, a current I had known my whole life. I recited the entire sonnet, my voice gaining strength with each line. The room was silent except for my voice and the storm raging outside. The lamplight caught the angles of his face, casting his eyes into shadow. He didn't move. He just watched me, his head tilted slightly, an expression of profound stillness on his face. When I finished, the silence that followed was different. It wasn't the tense, analytical silence of the classroom. It was heavy, charged, full of unspoken things. Music, When soft voices die, he prompted, his voice a low whisper. Vibrates in the memory, I continued, my gaze locked with his. Odors, when sweet violets sicken, live within the sense they quicken. We were no longer professor and student. We were two people, isolated from the world by a tempest, connected by the ghost of a poet who had been dead for 200 years. The playing field had been leveled. He had the authority, the degree, the position. But I had the words. They were written on my heart. He leaned back in his chair, the leather creaking in the quiet room. He never took his eyes off me. You have them all memorized. It wasn't a question. It was a statement of awe. I read them a lot, I stammered, the spell broken, feeling suddenly shy and overexposed. No, he said, his voice firm. It's more than that. You don't just read them. You inhabit them. That's what's missing from your paper. That passion. Why do you hide it? The question was too direct, too personal. It hit me right where my armor was thinnest. I looked down at my hands, hidden in the long sleeves of his jacket. I don't know, I mumbled, which was a lie. I knew exactly why. To show that kind of passion was to be vulnerable. It was to show the world where you could be hurt. The storm outside seemed to intensify, the wind screaming around the corners of the building. The small office felt like the only safe place in the world. A tiny lamplit bubble of quiet and warmth. I was like you know, he said softly. My head snapped up. I couldn't imagine him being like me in any way. He was confidence personified, a force of nature. When I was an undergraduate, he clarified, I lived in books. I was terrified of speaking in class. I thought if I just wrote brilliant impersonal essays, it would be enough. My mentor told me the same thing I'm telling you. He said, Julian, there's a fire in you. Stop trying to hide the smoke. Julian. His name hung in the air between us. It was a revelation. A piece of himself he had never offered before. It felt like a gift. I singled out your paper, Leo, he continued, his voice dropping even lower, becoming more intimate. I told myself it was because I saw the potential, the raw intellect that needed to be challenged, and that was true. He paused, and his gaze was so intense it felt like a physical touch. But it was also a lie. My heart was hammering against my ribs, a frantic, desperate rhythm. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. There was only the sound of the rain, the dim light, and the weight of his stare. The truth is, he said, each word chosen with deliberate care. I was intrigued by the mind behind the words. I found myself looking for you in the lecture hall. Your passion, even when you try to hide it, is compelling. It's distracting. This was it. The confession. The moment the world tilted on its axis. He was talking about loneliness, about the sterile, isolating world of academia. He was talking about seeing something in me, something I kept deliberately hidden. He was seeing me. He stood up and walked around the desk, stopping just in front of my chair. He was so close. I had to crane my neck to look up at him. The lamplight carved his face into a landscape of shadow and gold. I could see the subtle shift of the muscles in his jaw, the dark intensity of his eyes. I shouldn't be saying this, he whispered, and his voice was rough with an emotion I couldn't name. Why? I whispered back, my own voice trembling. He didn't answer with words. Instead, he slowly, hesitantly, reached out and cupped my cheek. His hand was large and warm, his palm slightly rough against my skin. It was the most deliberate, most terrifying, most wonderful thing I had ever felt. The calloused skin of his thumb brushed against my lower lip, and a shiver racked my entire body. My eyes fluttered shut. This was impossible. This wasn't happening. He leaned down, and I could feel the warmth of his breath on my face. It was a question. His closeness was a question. His hand on my skin was a question, and I answered it. I leaned into his touch, a small, almost imperceptible movement. It was all the encouragement he needed. His lips met mine. It wasn't a frantic, passionate kiss like in the movies. It was slow, hesitant, unspeakably gentle. It was a kiss full of doubt and longing and years of unspoken things. His lips were soft, questioning. It was a search, an exploration. He was learning the shape of me, and I was learning the taste of him. Coffee and rain, and something that was just Julian. I brought my own hands up, my fingers tangling in the thick fabric of his sweater, holding on as if he were the only solid thing in a dissolving world. He made a low sound in the back of his throat and deepened the kiss, his other hand coming up to cradle the back of my head, his fingers threading through my hair. The world outside, with its screaming wind and lashing rain, ceased to exist. My carefully cataloged library of a life was on fire, and he was the one who had struck the match. Every wall I had ever built, every defense I had ever constructed, crumbled into dust. There was only this man, this tiny lamp-lit room, this kiss that was rewriting my entire existence. I don't know how long we stayed like that. Time had become fluid, meaningless. Eventually, the kiss broke, and we were left breathing the same air, his forehead resting against mine. My eyes were still closed. I was afraid to open them, afraid that the world would rush back in and this would all turn out to be a dream. "Leo," he breathed, his voice thick. I opened my eyes. He was looking at me with an expression of such raw, unguarded vulnerability that it stole the air from my lungs. The arrogant professor was gone. The intimidating scholar was gone. There was only Julian, looking at me as if I were a mystery he was desperate to solve. We didn't talk much after that. Words felt inadequate, clumsy. He pulled the leather armchair closer to his desk chair, and we sat in the dark, his arm around me, my head resting on his shoulder. We listened to the storm as it slowly, gradually exhausted itself. Sometime in the deep hours of the night, I fell asleep, wrapped in his jacket, lulled by the steady rhythm of his breathing and the fading sound of the rain. I woke to the jarring, unfamiliar sensation of sunlight on my face. For a moment I was disoriented. The room was bright, washed in the clean, sharp light of a morning after a storm. I was slumped in the armchair, a crick in my neck. Julian's jacket was draped over me like a blanket, and I was alone. The office was empty. The door was slightly ajar. I could hear the distant, familiar sounds of the university waking up, the hum of the fluorescent lights in the hallway, the murmur of voices. The power was back on. The world had returned to normal. A cold knot of dread formed in my stomach. I sat up, my heart starting to pound. The magic of the night, the intimacy of the storm-tossed darkness, had vanished with the dawn. In its place was a harsh, unforgiving reality. He was my professor. I was his student. What had we done? The door creaked open, and he walked in, holding 2 paper cups of coffee. He stopped when he saw I was awake, and the man from the night before was gone. Professor Croft was back. His face was a mask of cool professionalism. His posture was stiff. He wouldn't meet my eyes. "You were asleep," he said, his voice clipped and formal. He set one of the coffees on the edge of the desk, a careful distance from me. "I thought you could use this." The silence was a physical weight, a thick, suffocating thing. I fumbled to take off his jacket, folding it carefully and placing it on the arm of the chair. The warmth of it was gone. "Thank you," I said, my own voice a strained whisper. "I'll drive you home. he said. It wasn't an offer. It was a statement, a transaction being completed. The drive was excruciating. 10 minutes of absolute crushing silence. He kept his eyes fixed on the road, his hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles were white. I stared out the passenger window at a world that looked scoured clean by the rain, feeling anything but. I felt dirty, ashamed, a fool. He pulled up in front of my apartment building. I reached for the door handle, desperate to escape. Professor, I started, not even knowing what I was going to say. Apologize? Ask what it meant? Pretend it never happened? We have a class to prepare for, Mr. Vance, he said, cutting me off. His voice was cold, final. He was still staring straight ahead. I'll see you on Tuesday. And that was it. He dismissed me, like a student, like nothing had happened. I stumbled out of the car, my legs unsteady. I didn't look back as he drove away. I couldn't bear it. I got into my apartment, locked the door behind me, and slid down to the floor, my mind a screaming vortex of doubt and self-recrimination. It was a mistake, a catastrophic, career-ending mistake for him, and a heart-shattering one for me. I had misread everything. The intimacy of the storm, the vulnerability, the confession. It was a momentary lapse in judgment, an aberration brought on by darkness and forced proximity. And now, in the cold light of day, he regretted it deeply. The next few days were a special kind of hell. My quiet, solitary life, which had once been a comfort, now felt like a punishment. The silence in my apartment was no longer peaceful. It was a gaping void, an absence. Every corner of it screamed his name. Julian. I didn't sleep. I replayed every moment from that night in his office, dissecting every word, every touch, searching for the clue I had missed. I tortured myself with it. The memory of the kiss, which had been so beautiful, was now tainted with shame. I skipped his Tuesday lecture. I couldn't face him. I couldn't sit in that room under his cool, professional gaze and pretend my entire world hadn't been torn apart and clumsily stitched back together. I sent him a brief formal email, claiming I had the flu. His reply was even more brief. Understood. See the course website for missed materials. Not even a hope you feel better. Just nothing. The silence stretched. A day, 2 days, a week. My old solitude returned, but it was different now. It was haunted. I had tasted connection, real, profound connection, and now its absence was a constant, aching pain. I was more alone than I had ever been before. I forced myself to go to the library on Friday. I had to maintain some semblance of my old routine, or I felt like I might actually disappear. I found an empty carrel in the deepest, most remote section of the stacks, a place where I was unlikely to see anyone. I surrounded myself with books, my old, faithful friends, but they offered no comfort. Their words were just black marks on a page. I was trying to read the same paragraph for the 10th time when a shadow fell over my book. My head snapped up. It was him. He stood there, looking down at me, and the sight of him sent a painful jolt through my system. He looked awful. Worse than I did. There were dark circles under his eyes, and his face was pale and drawn. The confident, imposing professor was gone again, replaced by this exhausted, uncertain man. Leo, he said, his voice quiet, rough. I just stared at him, my heart a painful, throbbing lump in my throat. I couldn't speak. Can we talk? He asked. Please. I gave a small, jerky nod. He pulled up a chair from a nearby table and sat, mirroring our positions in his office a lifetime ago. The students murmuring at a nearby table, the faint beep of a book scanner, it all faded away. There was only him. I'm sorry, he said, the words coming out in a rush, for how I acted, for the drive home, for everything. I handled it badly. I panicked. He looked down at his hands, which were clasped tightly on the table in front of him. He looked so unlike himself, so vulnerable. I've been a professor for 10 years, Leo, he said, his voice low and strained. I have never, not once, crossed that line. There are rules, boundaries. My entire career is built on maintaining that professional distance. He finally looked up, and his eyes were filled with a desperate, pleading honesty. And then you started reciting Shelley in the dark, and every single one of those rules just ceased to matter. I felt a fragile, tentative shoot of hope push its way through the compacted soil of my misery. I woke up that morning, he continued, and the sun was shining, and all I could think about was the consequences. My job, my reputation, your academic career. I was terrified, so I put the walls back up. I pushed you away, because I was a coward. He took a deep breath. It's been the worst week of my life. I can't eat. I can't sleep. I walk into that lecture hall, and the only thing I can see is your empty chair. The silence, the distance. It's unbearable. I was so afraid of the risk that I didn't realize the greater risk was losing. Whatever that was. Whatever started in my office during the storm. He reached across the table, his hand hovering just above mine. He didn't touch me. He was giving me the choice. I can't stop thinking about you, Leo, he whispered, and the confession was as raw and as real as the first one had been. And I don't want to be your professor anymore. My breath hitched. I slowly, deliberately, turned my hand over and slid it under his. Our fingers interlaced. His hand was warm, and it felt like coming home. The connection, the current, was still there, stronger than ever. A small, relieved smile touched his lips for the first time. It transformed his face, chasing away the exhaustion. Will you have dinner with me tonight? He asked, not as Professor Croft, as Julian. Yes, I said, my voice thick with unshed tears. Yes, Julian, I will. He pulled a pen from his pocket and grabbed a stray library slip. He wrote down a series of numbers and pushed it across the table to me. His personal number. A tangible symbol. A key. I'll pick you up at 7, he said. And just like that, the storm inside me finally broke. The next few weeks were a blur of tentative firsts. The first dinner, where we talked for hours about everything and nothing. The first walk in the park, where he took my hand in public, his grip firm and unapologetic. The first time I went to his apartment, a place that felt even more like him than his office, filled with books and music and the comfortable clutter of a life lived. Each step was a negotiation with fear. His fear of professional ruin, my fear of emotional risk. We talked about it. We had the clarifying conversation, the honest one where we both admitted that this new territory was frightening, but that the thought of retreating back into our old, lonely worlds was infinitely more terrifying. And then came the morning that changed everything. I had stayed the night at his apartment. We had fallen asleep tangled together, the sound of his steady breathing, the most comforting lullaby I had ever known. I woke up first, just as the sun was beginning to spill pale golden light into the room. For a moment, the old anxiety flared, the morning after panic, the fear that he would be distant, that the light of day would bring regret. I held my breath, waiting for the familiar chill. But it never came. He was still asleep, his arm draped possessively over my waist. His face, in the soft morning light, was relaxed, peaceful. The harsh lines of stress and academic rigor were smoothed away. He looked younger. He looked happy. I watched him breathe for a long time, the simple, miraculous rise and fall of his chest. I felt a sense of peace settle over me, so profound it was almost dizzying. This was real. This was safe. I carefully slipped out of bed, pulling on one of his shirts that hung down to my knees. I padded into the kitchen. The room was filled with morning light, dust motes dancing in the sunbeams. I found the coffee maker, the filters, the bag of dark roast beans. I started making coffee, the familiar domestic ritual, a quiet anchor in this new life. The aroma of brewing coffee filled the small apartment. I felt a pair of strong arms wrap around me from behind, and a warm body press against my back. He rested his chin on my shoulder, his voice a sleepy, contented rumble in my ear. "Good morning." I leaned back against him, my eyes closing. "Morning." He turned me in his arms, his hands framing my face. He looked at me, his gaze soft and full of a warmth that I was finally beginning to believe in. "I like waking up to this," he said quietly. "To you." He kissed me, a slow, deep, lazy morning kiss that tasted of sleep and coffee, and the promise of a future I had never dared to imagine for myself. There was no hesitation, no fear, just a simple, profound rightness. As I stood there in his kitchen, wrapped in his arms, the sunlight streaming through the window, I thought about the man I used to be, the boy who hid in the back of the classroom, who built walls of words to keep the world at bay. My life had been a quiet, ordered, lonely thing. A story with no plot. Julian had been the storm I never saw coming. He was the plot twist, the disruption that had forced me out of my comfortable solitude. He had seen the fire in me when all I showed the world was smoke, and he hadn't been afraid to get closer. He had taught me that vulnerability wasn't a weakness, but a prerequisite for connection. He had taught me how to live in the uncertainties, the mysteries, the doubts, without that irritable reaching after fact and reason. He had taught me about love. He pulled away slightly, a smile playing on his lips. "You know," he said, his voice laced with amusement, "your final paper is due next week." I groaned, burying my face in his chest. "Don't remind me." He chuckled, the sound a warm vibration against my cheek. "I have a feeling," he said, his arms tightening around me, "that this time it won't be so impersonal." And I knew he was right. Because now, when I wrote about passion, about connection, about the terrifying, beautiful risk of letting someone see your soul, I would finally know what I was talking about. I would be writing about us.